It was early October when I decided I needed a break from everything. I'd been working overtime for nearly 3 months straight, barely sleeping, barely eating right. I felt like I was on autopilot. One night, around 2 a.m., I started looking up cabins for rent online. I wasn't looking for luxury, just something quiet, surrounded by woods, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no distractions. I found a place about 5 hours north of where I live. It was small, worn down looking, but tucked deep in a wooded area near a lake. The photos showed just one room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a small bathroom. It looked like exactly what I needed. The next day, I packed a bag with basic clothes, some groceries, my hunting knife, and a paperback novel. I didn't bring much else. The drive out was peaceful. Roads got narrower the further north I went. I drove past cornfields, empty barns, and long stretches of thick trees. There were hardly any cars. By the time I turned off the last paved road, my phone had lost signal. The dirt road leading to the cabin was bumpy and overgrown, but manageable. When I finally pulled up, it was almost evening. The sky was pale orange, and the air was cold. The cabin looked even older in person. The wood was dark and cracked. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. But the lockbox code worked, and I let myself in. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. It was quiet, no humming appliances, no traffic in the distance. Just wind outside, and the sound of dry leaves moving around. Felt good, honestly, like I could breathe again. I unpacked my bag, put some canned food in the small fridge, and lit the wood stove since it was already getting chilly. That night, I sat outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars. I hadn't seen a sky like that in years. No light pollution, no planes overhead. Just stars and the faint sound of water from the lake a little ways down the hill. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The next couple of days were slow, but I liked that. I hiked the trails near the lake, read my book, and sat by the water for hours. I found a fallen tree where I liked to sit and watch the ripples. The air smelled like pine and wet leaves. I didn't see another person the whole time. Occasionally I saw deer tracks or heard branches snap in the distance. Once, I spotted a fox trotting along the opposite bank of the lake. But no people. That was the whole point. On the 4th day, things started feeling off. It began with small stuff. I woke up and noticed the curtain in the kitchen had been pulled open. I was sure I'd left it closed. Later, when I came back from a walk, the front door was slightly ajar. I knew I had shut it tight. There were scratch marks in the wood near the handle. I told myself maybe I hadn't closed it all the way and the wind pushed it open. The marks could have been old, but it nagged at me. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps on the gravel path outside. I stayed still in bed, heart racing, listening. When I finally got the nerve to peek out the window, there was nothing, just trees and darkness. But I kept feeling watched. I ended up keeping the hunting knife by my side. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for signs of animals. I thought maybe a raccoon had tried getting in, but there were no tracks, no droppings. Just more of those faint scratches around the door. I didn't like it. I told myself I'd just stay inside that day, keep the door locked, read, maybe cook something. In the afternoon, I heard movement outside. Not just wind, something crunching leaves, slow and steady. I looked out the front window, still nothing. Then I heard a light thump on the porch. I waited, nothing else. After an hour, I finally opened the door and checked. Sitting on the porch near the edge was a dead rabbit. His neck looked broken. No blood, just stiff and twisted. I stepped back inside and locked the door. I started thinking maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe a hunter or someone who lived nearby and didn't like strangers. I hadn't seen any other cabins, but maybe I missed something. Either way, I didn't feel safe anymore. I planned to leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive out at night, not through those dark back roads. That night, it got worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound like slow dragging on the porch. Not steps, something being pulled. Then a soft, rhythmic tapping on the front wall of the cabin. I lay frozen, barely breathing. The tapping stopped, then started again, a little louder. I reached for my knife. It went on for about 15 minutes, then silence. I didn't sleep again. I just sat up in bed, knife in hand, eyes on the window. As soon as it got light, I threw everything in my bag. I didn't even eat breakfast. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp and wet. There were deep scuff marks on the porch, and something had gouged part of the wooden post near the stairs. I didn't even want to think about what made them. The dirt road was slick from rain the night before. My tires skidded a little, but I managed to get back to the main road. It felt like I exhaled for the first time in days. Once I got phone signal, I called a friend just to hear another voice. I didn't tell them everything, just that I cut the trip short. Back home, I kept thinking about the cabin. I kept seeing that dead rabbit, hearing the tapping. Couldn't shake it. A few weeks later, I decided to look up the property. I found the listing again, and a note from the owner saying the cabin was temporarily closed. No reason given. Then I found a forum post from someone else who had stayed there about a year before me. They described the same thing. Scratches on the door, dead animals left on the porch, dragging sounds at night. They'd reported it to local authorities, but were told there were no houses nearby and no reports of trespassers. One reply said something about old poachers sometimes using the woods, but nothing concrete. That was enough for me. I haven't been back, and I never will. I still go camping sometimes, but I stay at places with other people around. I like quiet, but not like that. There's something different about being watched when you know you're truly alone. Something that makes your skin crawl. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I wasn't welcome, and I won't make the mistake of going back. I kept the knife on my nightstand for months after, just in case. Even now, sometimes when I hear branches snap in the wind or a thud outside my apartment, I get that same chill in my gut. I remind myself it's probably nothing, but I also remind myself that sometimes nothing is exactly what's out there, and it's watching. I had been planning the trip for a few months, ever since I found the cabin listing on an old forum where people shared off-the-grid spots for hunters and hikers. The post was from a few years back, but I tracked down the coordinates someone had shared and matched them up with satellite maps. The cabin was deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, surrounded by miles of forest in every direction. No roads went directly to it, just a faint trail that cut through the trees from a service road. It seemed perfect, secluded, quiet, somewhere I could clear my head. I'd taken time off work and told everyone I needed a solo week in nature. My job was stressful, my sleep was off, and I hadn't had a real break in over a year. I packed carefully: camp stove, canned food, first aid kit, maps, compass, backup GPS, a portable charger, even bear spray. I brought a rifle too, just in case. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I figured it was smart to have it out there. I also had a journal, a few books, and enough gear to last me a good 10 days if I got snowed in or lost. The drive up took nearly 12 hours. Most of it was highways and paved roads, but the last 3 hours were on winding gravel paths, followed by a long walk with my pack through forest so dense the sky disappeared. The trail was barely there. I kept losing it, checking my GPS constantly. When I finally saw the outline of the cabin through the trees, it was already late afternoon and my shirt was soaked through with sweat. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just one room with a loft up top, with stove in the corner, and a narrow porch. No power, no plumbing. The door creaked when I opened it, and the inside smelled like dust and cedar. There were cobwebs in the corners and some old canned goods on a shelf that I didn't trust. The windows were boarded from the inside with thick planks, probably to keep animals out. I found a rusty hatchet under the cot and some firewood stacked in a corner, dry and brittle. I aired the place out and got to work setting up. That first night, the forest was louder than I expected. I lay in the cot staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the cracking of branches and distant calls of birds, or maybe coyotes. The wind made the trees groan. It wasn't scary exactly, but it put me on edge. I hadn't realized how unused I was to real silence. No hum of electricity, no passing cars, no planes overhead. Just the forest breathing all around me. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun barely came through the trees, but enough to light the room in a soft gray. I made instant coffee on the camp stove and went to chop some firewood. After that, I hiked a few miles, mostly to get my bearings. The woods were thick with pine and birch, the ground soft and covered with old needles and leaves. No signs of other people. No wrappers, no footprints, no old fire rings. It felt like no one had been out there in years. By the third day, I was settling into a rhythm. Wake up, hike, write a little, cook, sleep. I hadn't seen any animals bigger than a squirrel, and the quiet was starting to grow on me. But that night, I noticed something strange. Just before I went to sleep, I stepped out onto the porch to brush my teeth. I had my headlamp on, the red light, so I wouldn't mess up my night vision. As I looked around the woods, I saw something, a shape maybe 30 yards off between the trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there. I froze. My light barely reached that far, but the shape didn't move. I stared for a long time. After a minute or two, I convinced myself it was just a tree, a trick of shadows. I finished brushing my teeth and went back inside. But the next day, I checked. I walked out to where I thought I'd seen it. There were trees, sure, but nothing that matched the shape I thought I'd seen. I looked for tracks, but didn't find any. Still, I felt watched. It lingered with me all day. That night, I double-checked that the door was locked. I moved the cot away from the window. I kept the rifle loaded and within reach. On the fifth day, something woke me up around 3 a.m. It was a thump, like something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. Not hard, just enough to rattle the wall. I sat up. My mouth was dry. I waited, listening. Nothing. I didn't hear footsteps or voices. I didn't hear an animal scampering. Just the wind again, and maybe something dragging against the wood siding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. I found scratches in the dirt near the back corner. Not claw marks, more like something had been dragged. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and heading back to the car. But I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe an animal had come through. Maybe it was just part of being out in the woods alone. I told myself I needed to push through the fear and stay the full week. That night, I was sitting at the table writing when I heard something again. It was soft, like footsteps, maybe 10 feet outside the window. I turned off the lantern. The cabin went dark. I sat still, straining to listen. Then I heard it again, slower this time. A footstep, then another. The sound of leaves being pressed down. I picked up the rifle and waited. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the light. The steps circled the cabin once. Then nothing. No door opening. No more sounds. Just nothing. I stayed awake all night. At sunrise, I opened the door and stepped outside. There were no tracks. No sign anyone had been there. I was jumpy the entire day. Every twig snap made my skin crawl. I kept checking over my shoulder. The next night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lantern on and sat with my back against the wall, the rifle across my lap. Nothing happened. Not a single noise. But the next morning, I found the latch on the woodshed had been undone. The door was open a few inches. I hadn't opened it since I arrived. Something was wrong. I packed everything by mid-morning. I left the cabin exactly as I found it, except I boarded the door from the outside. I hiked back fast, almost running at some parts. The forest didn't feel the same. Felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to rest. When I got to the car, I threw my pack in the back and didn't even change out of my boots before starting the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the highway. Not relaxed, just not on edge. I got home late that night and slept for nearly 12 hours. A few weeks later, I tried to find the post again, the one that led me to the cabin. It was gone. Deleted, maybe, or the whole thread was scrubbed. I couldn't find the coordinates either. They weren't in my saved files. I know I had them written down. I searched through my notebooks and phone and found nothing. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I haven't gone camping at all. I still think about that place sometimes, and every time I do, I feel cold. Not scared, just cold. Like something followed me back and never fully left. But nothing ever happened after. Nothing chased me. Nothing showed up in my house. Life just went on. But I know what I felt. I know something was out there. and I'm not going back. I had never been much for the woods, but when my cousin offered me the keys to his old hunting cabin for a long weekend, I said yes without thinking much about it. He told me it was basic, no Wi-Fi, no cable, no running water, but it was quiet, private, and surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. That sounded like exactly what I needed. Work had been grinding me down. My days were all emails and Zoom calls and fake smiles. At night, I just stared at my ceiling until the sun came up. I needed a break from everything. So, I packed some supplies, canned food, a water jug, a few tools, a sleeping bag, and drove 6 hours north into the woods of Michigan, following the GPS until the cell service dropped, and all I had left was a printed map and a yellow sticky note with the cabin's lock code. The gravel road leading up to the property was barely wide enough for my car. Tree branches scraped the sides like fingers, and the road sloped and dipped in ways that made me feel like my tires would spin out at any second. I had to drive slower than walking speed for the last mile. The cabin appeared out of nowhere, just a squat wooden box with a tin roof, leaning slightly to one side. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, half swallowed by thick pine trees. There was a busted-up fire pit off to one side and a pile of firewood stacked under a blue tarp that looked like it hadn't been touched in a year. No other buildings in sight, no power lines, no trails, just this one old cabin lost in the woods. When I got out of the car, the silence was loud. I could hear the creak of trees moving, the high buzz of insects, and my own breathing. That was it. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of anything man-made. I felt a chill even though it was warm out. I shook it off, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. It was smaller than I expected. One main room with a wood stove, a folding table, and a cot. The windows were covered in dust and dead bugs. The floor was uneven, and I had to duck under a beam near the middle. There was a small attached storage room in the back where the tools and canned goods were kept. No bathroom, just an outhouse a few yards out back. I dropped my gear on the cot and opened all the windows. The air inside was thick with that dry, musty smell old wood gets when it hasn't been lived in. I sat down on the cot and listened. Still just trees and bugs. That first day went by slowly. I unpacked, set up a little cooking area with a portable burner, swept out the worst of the dirt, and started a small fire in the pit before sundown. I tried to relax, to let the quiet sink in, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt off, like the woods were waiting for something. The feeling got worse that night. I went to bed around 10. I hadn't brought a flashlight, just a lantern and my phone's limited battery. I turned the lantern off, settled into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. The woods outside weren't quiet anymore. They were full of tiny sounds, crackling leaves, sticks snapping, the occasional low rustle like something big moving far off. Every little noise made me tense up. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I kept waking up to the same thing. Footsteps. Not loud, not close, but steady, crunching through the brush in slow, careful paces. I sat up more than once, heart pounding, holding my breath to hear better. Each time, the sound would stop the moment I moved, and then it would start again 10 or 15 minutes later. Never close enough to be sure, but never far enough to ignore. I stayed up the rest of the night, just sitting in the dark, waiting for the sun. When the light finally broke through the trees the next morning, I felt stupid. It was probably just animals. Deer maybe, a raccoon. I told myself that over and over. I drank some water, ate a can of beans cold, and went for a walk around the property. The trees grew thick in every direction. No trails, no signs of people, just endless green. I walked a few hundred yards out in each direction, marking my way with stones and broken branches so I wouldn't get turned around. The only thing I found was an old, rusted game trap hanging from a branch. It had long since been tripped and forgotten. Nothing else, just trees and moss and the slow, hot buzz of summer. The second night was worse. I made a bigger fire that evening and stayed close to it for as long as I could. I didn't go inside until the logs were nothing but orange coals. I kept the lantern on low, set it near the cot, and laid back down. I tried to block the noises out, but my ears were tuned for them now. The footsteps came back, closer this time. There was a point, maybe around 2 in the morning, when I heard them right outside the window. Slow, steady steps on dry pine needles. Then nothing. Total silence. I sat up and stared at the window until my eyes ached. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe too loud. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I checked the dirt outside the window. No prints, nothing disturbed, but the feeling stuck with me, like someone had been there, like I had been watched. I didn't know what to do. My phone was nearly dead. No bars. The road back to town was long, narrow, and rough. I wasn't ready to give up and go home after just 2 nights. It would feel like losing, like giving in to my own fear. So I stayed. One more night, I told myself. Just one. I tried to keep busy that day. Chopped wood, reorganized supplies, cleaned out the storage room. That's when I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a small cardboard box shoved into the back corner, behind a few old lanterns. Inside were a few torn-up hunting magazines, a pair of gloves, and a Polaroid photo. The picture showed a man standing in front of the cabin, probably 30 years ago based on the faded colors. He was tall, bearded, wearing a dark jacket. But the weird part was what was written on the back of the photo. March 14th, second warning. That was it. No name, no explanation. I stared at it for a long time. The writing looked rushed, angry. I flipped it back over, studied the man's face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even looking at the camera. He was staring off to the side, like something had caught his attention in the woods. I put the box back exactly how I found it and closed the storage room door. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. I sat in the middle of the cabin with my back to the wall, a kitchen knife in one hand and the lantern on full brightness beside me. Every so often I'd hear a noise. Twigs snapping, wind through the trees, the low groan of the cabin settling, and I'd freeze. Then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it. A single, slow step on the porch. Not the woods, not distant, right outside the door. Another step, then another, creaking, deliberate, as if whoever it was wanted me to hear. My heart slammed so hard I thought it might stop altogether. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. There was no knock, no voice, just that single set of footsteps slowly crossing the porch. Then silence. I sat there until sunrise, knife in hand, eyes burning. When it got light enough to see, I opened the door. The porch was empty, but the middle step, the one that creaked the loudest, was wet. Just that one board. Damp in a perfect footprint shape, like someone had stepped in a puddle and then stopped right there. I had no more excuses. I packed up. I shoved everything back into my bags, didn't even bother cleaning up, and got in the car. The road out was worse than I remembered. Every pothole felt like it was trying to trap me. Every tree looked like it was leaning a little too close. When I hit the first paved road, I almost cried. I drove straight into town, found the nearest gas station, and sat in the parking lot with my doors locked for 20 minutes before I could breathe again. Back home, I tried to forget about it. I didn't talk to anyone about what happened. I didn't tell my cousin. I didn't even look at the photo again. I put it in the back of my closet in an old shoebox and tried to move on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was out there behind the cabin. They knew I was there. They watched me. Maybe they'd done it before. Maybe they'd do it again. And I realized something later that made my skin crawl. That porch step wasn't just wet. It was wet with something thick. Something that had a dark red tint that didn't come from water. I never went back to the cabin. I never asked my cousin who the man in the photo was, or what he meant by second warning. I didn't want to know, and I still keep that knife by my bed, just in case. I'm not sure what made me think a solo weekend in the woods was a good idea. Maybe it was burnout from my job. Maybe I just needed to get away from everything, screens, people, noise. I'd been working non-stop for almost a year, and when I stumbled across the listing for a secluded rental cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho, it seemed like fate. It was cheap, off-grid, and sat alone at the edge of Buckhorn Ridge. I booked it for 4 nights. The drive there took over 6 hours. The last stretch was rough, twisting gravel roads with deep potholes, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Trees grew thick on both sides. There were no signs, no fences, just wild, dense forest. Eventually, I pulled up to a narrow trail marked only by a faded wooden stake. I followed it until I reached the cabin. It sat on a small clearing no more than 30 feet wide. Beyond that, it was all thick timber. The cabin looked worn, but sturdy. Weathered logs, a mossy roof, and a wraparound porch that leaned slightly on one side. No electricity, no plumbing, just a fireplace, a wood stove, and a hand pump for water about 50 yards out near a pile of chopped firewood. Inside, it smelled like old pine and smoke. There was a small bed, a battered wooden table, 2 chairs, and a shelf filled with canned food and survival books. The windows had shutters on the outside but no curtains. There was a journal left by a previous guest who wrote about enjoying the peace and quiet. That's what I wanted too, peace and quiet. I spent the first day unpacking. I brought a cooler, dry food, a hatchet, flashlight, notebooks, and some paperbacks. I hiked the nearby slope for a bit, got a feel for the terrain. It was beautiful up there, so quiet it made your ears ring. I set up a fire pit behind the cabin and boiled some water from the pump just to be safe. Later that afternoon, I found a rusted axe wedged into a stump near the treeline. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Beside it were some boot prints, not mine. I figured they were left by a hunter or a hiker. It didn't bother me at first. That night, I built a small fire in the hearth and wrote a few pages in my journal. The wind pushed against the walls softly, and I could hear something moving through the brush outside. I assumed it was a raccoon or a deer. Still, I latched the door and placed my axe near the bed. I didn't sleep well. The cabin creaked and groaned with the cold. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a scratching sound, something outside moving slowly around the porch. I held my breath and listened. It circled the cabin once, then it was quiet again. In the morning, I found scuff marks on the porch and a few overturned logs by the woodpile. I told myself it was a bear, or maybe a coyote, but the prints didn't look like paws. They looked like boots, heavy ones. On the second day, I tried to brush it off. I boiled water, cooked rice, and sat outside with a book. But I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every time I looked up from the page, I expected to see someone just standing at the edge of the trees. No one ever was. That evening, I noticed a can of beans missing from the shelf. I thought maybe I just forgot I ate it, but the can wasn't in the trash or anywhere else. I searched the cabin, even the outhouse. Nothing. I remembered a mention in the guest journal about an old trail camera set up behind the cabin. I looked around and found it nailed to a tree about 20 feet into the woods, aimed at the back porch. It still had a memory card inside. I didn't have a laptop, but I had an adapter in my phone, so I powered it up and scrolled through the photos. Most were just trees and shadows. Fox once. Then I found a shot taken the night before. Someone standing just outside the porch behind the railing. No face, just the shape of a man. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at the cabin. I couldn't sit still after that. I kept checking the windows. I barely touched my dinner. That night, I stayed up late with the axe in my lap, the fire burning low. Around midnight, I heard a crunch in the brush, then a soft thud on the porch. I didn't move. After a minute, something tugged at the door handle gently. It stopped after a few seconds. I sat there in the dark for hours before I finally drifted off. When I woke up, the door was still shut. Nothing was broken, but I found a boot print in the ash pile outside. The same kind I saw near the axe earlier. This was no animal. Someone was out there. I decided I had to leave. I packed everything fast. It was still early morning. The car was parked down the trail about a quarter mile. When I reached it, I found the hood slightly ajar. I opened it and saw the battery cable had been yanked clean off. The bolt was missing. I stood there in silence, stomach sinking. Whoever was out there didn't want me to leave. My phone had no signal. It was 12 miles to the nearest ranger station. Sun was already climbing. I had to move. I threw what I could into my backpack. Water bottle, food bars, flashlight, knife, and locked the car behind me. Even though it wouldn't help much, I started down the trail, trying to keep a steady pace. I kept glancing back, but saw nothing. About 2 miles in, I heard something. Footsteps, light but steady. They followed from a distance. I turned and looked. Nothing. I picked up speed. After a few miles, I tried a shortcut I'd seen on a map inside the cabin. An old logging path. I figured it would save me an hour. The brush was thick. I had to push through branches and thorny shrubs. The ground was uneven. I slipped. My foot hit a rock under a bed of leaves and I fell hard down a slope. I tumbled until I hit the bottom, my leg twisted and throbbing. Couldn't stand. I sat there in the dirt, heart pounding, ears ringing. Couldn't go back. I couldn't stay. I used a stick as a crutch and limped off the slope, dragging myself a few hundred yards into a denser patch of trees. I found a spot behind a fallen log and made a little shelter using pine branches and a tarp I had in my pack. I wrapped my leg with a scarf and drank the last of my water. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing twigs snapping in the distance. Something was out there. I stayed completely still, knife in hand. At one point, I thought I saw a light. A faint flicker through the trees, but it vanished. At dawn, I crawled out. My leg was stiff, but I could move it. I limped through the trees for hours. I rationed an energy bar into 4 bites. My throat was raw. My vision swam. Then, as I rounded a bend near a creek, I saw them. 2 forest rangers on ATVs. They stopped when they saw me. I broke down crying. They called for help, gave me water, patched my leg, and radioed for a pickup. I told them everything. They looked grim. One of them told me I was lucky to be alive. Later, I learned the Forest Service had been dealing with reports of a man living off-grid in those woods, stealing supplies, stalking hikers. They never caught him, but they found signs near the cabin. Trash piles, shelters made of branches, and footprints that matched the ones I'd seen. My car was towed out. I went home and put the cabin up for sale a week later. I never went back. I learned that isolation is not always peaceful. Silence can be a warning. And sometimes, when your gut tells you something's wrong, you need to listen. I thought I was prepared, but I was just lucky. No fairy tale, just real danger and real escape.